Hello and welcome to the Innovators Assembly. The Innovators Assembly is an event that is run by the Innovation Network, a friendly and dynamic community of accomplished leaders and technologists in high-tech manufacturing. We share learning and stories, useful connections are made, and serendipity occurs. The mission of the Assembly is to provide a unique opportunity for innovators to step outside their immediate focus on technology and consider major developments and topical issues in 4 levels of landscape that form the context in which innovation takes place: global, national, organisational and individual. My name is Siobhan Soraghan and I'm the facilitator of the network, and in different times we would have been hosting the Assembly in a conference venue, but this year, due to the pandemic, we've moved the Assembly online, and this has presented a few opportunities. So instead of 9 speakers, we're now able to field 12 experts over 4 weeks, each week addressing one of the 4 landscapes. And of course, you'll be able to watch each interview at your leisure. Secondly, the new format allows us considerably more time with each speaker, so we get more of a sense of who each person is and what they're about. And thirdly, for those of you subscribing before the launch date, we have a live community gathering or cafe where the speakers will be present, giving attendees the chance to explore with them the issues that they've raised. So now to today's topic. Previously, we've been looking at global themes like resourcing rare earth elements, the secret of the cloud, the sustainability of transport, decarbonising energy in the UK, moving down to the national landscape, different energy sources, recycling of plastics, and other topics. Now we're going to take a look at technology that seems to be finding a particularly relevant role in these strange times here in the UK when social distancing has become so important. Originally, when I approached our interviewee for this session, the focus was going to be on how technology facilitates flexible working. But now it will be a bit more than that, and I think you'll find out why very soon, and it's fascinating. It's my great pleasure to introduce Mark Sorsa-Leslie. Mark qualified as a chartered surveyor in 1994, working in Aberdeenshire in the council and in Chesterton. In 2001, he founded Open Era Systems, one of the UK's first online property management systems companies, gaining clients including BNP Paribas Real Estate. I nearly said that with a French accent. After 8 years in Finland, running a venture capital-backed startup, he returned to form Beringar with co-founder Paul Byrne. His vision with Paul was to take the real estate industry to the next level using the power of IoT, the Internet of Things. So, Mark, welcome. It's really good to have you here.
Thank you very much, Siobhan. It's an absolute pleasure to be here.
Or there, as the case may be.
Yes, indeed. Yes.
So, what I do with all of our interviewees, if it's all right, Mark, I ask them to tell us a little bit about how their career began and how they've ended up doing what they're doing now. So yeah, what's your story?
So my story, as you pointed out in the intro, is that I trained as a chartered surveyor, and actually Paul and I started together as trainee surveyors. So we go right back to the beginning of our careers, working together. And I guess that data and property have always been intertwined for me. When I joined the local authority, about 2 weeks after, 2 big brown boxes appeared, and our director at the time came to my desk and said, "Have you ever used a computer?" And I said, "Yes, I've used a Sinclair Spectrum and a Commodore 64. I know how computers work." And he said, "Great. Well, you two guys, you and Paul, go and set up the computer, work out how it works, and then teach all of us, since you're the young ones that know how computers work." And I guess that from there, I've been kind of building and developing systems that have allowed my clients to manage their properties more effectively, to store and maintain databases of information about property, and kind of have understood all along the way that it's quite difficult to characterize a building in terms of data, but once you do it, you really uncover quite a lot of new information about the performance of the space, the performance of the building, and what it should be doing, in terms of generating value for customers, being a productive space that you use to live and work in, or an asset that you are going to look to transact at some point in the future. So yeah, it's always been property and data. Those two things have always gone hand in hand. When I returned from Finland, I got together with Paul again, and we kind of had always said that we should start a business together. And we kind of agreed that, okay, now's maybe a good time to think about how we adopt this new technology that's emerging, these sensors, low-cost sensors that are emerging, and think about how do we get inside a building and understand what's going on. And frankly speaking, we didn't really understand the difficulty of the task that we were taking on. But what we've done with Beringar is to create a business that for the first time provides data about what's actually happening inside a building in real time. New information that can be used by the occupants, the landlords, the designers, the insurance companies, anyone that kind of wants to understand what's going on inside a building. So it's been a real sort of journey of discovery, building hardware for the first time, but yeah, deeply rewarding.
Fascinating, fascinating. And you know, it's such a strange time we're in now, because so many people have been asked to get out of the buildings, and not because there's anything wrong with the buildings, but because we're frightened of each other, being close to each other. So I think that probably throws your whole business into another light in terms of what it can offer. So yeah, tell us more about how you see the impact on, you know, what you do, and you know, I'd be really interested to know how you're adapting to this demand.
Well, I guess that most organizations, when they acquire space, we're all pretty, you know, entrepreneurs are pretty optimistic people. Business people in general, I think, are generally optimistic. So they always acquire more space than they actually need, because they all believe that they're going to grow at a particular growth rate. And this inevitably leads to businesses having more space than they generally really need. And in some cases, that can be quite a lot. That can be 20 or 30% more space than you actually require. If you think about the cost of a desk in central London, it can range between 15 to 25,000 pounds a year in terms of cost. So having 20% or 30% more desks than you actually need is a big cost burden for the business. And of course, property is a cost line that if you make a saving, it goes straight to your profit line. It's fantastic from that point of view. There's a kind of one-to-one correlation, cost saving to profit. So in terms of flexible working, what we've kind of seen is over, I guess, a couple of decades, the move towards more flexible working, the technology enablement of flexible working, and the ability for people to choose more where they would like to be and where they would like to kind of conduct their work. But the real estate strategy hasn't necessarily kind of caught up with that. So you still have organizations that are carrying large amounts of space that they really don't need anymore because the people are not turning up to the building as much. And so the opportunity is to collect data about that, to understand the use pattern, and to be able to show an organization where they could reduce the amount of space that they have and how they could implement that flexible working and bring a bigger population of people to be served by a building, but a smaller footprint of building at the same time.
Yeah, and I imagine that the COVID-19 situation has accelerated that. But before we go on to that, I'm sure there are people watching who would be dying to know what the sensors actually do, and you know, what do they generate, and then how do you use that data?
So we've taken an approach where we wanted incredibly accurate information about where people were in a building. So our sensors are ceiling mounted units that are positioned generally in the center of a room or above a bank of desks. They look down and cover about 50 square meters of floor area, and they use machine vision to identify that there is a person in view and to return back the position of that person to us, so that we can display that on a floor plan in real time. So you can kind of think about what we're doing with the machine vision as actually creating the real life Harry Potter's Marauders map. that's what our floor plans look like. You can see small people on the floor plan. Now, what we don't do is we don't identify the people. We don't know who they are. Our sensor just knows that it has identified a person, and that's what we're interested in. We're a survey company, not a surveillance company. So we're interested in knowing where people are and how long they've been there for. Along with that, we're collecting indoor air quality, indoor temperature, humidity and pressure, noise levels and light levels. So kind of combining data about the impact that people are having on the building or the building is having on people. Because our starting point has always been that buildings are unaware of people. They have no concept that they have people inside them. They typically run by a time clock. So the lights come on at a time, or the ventilation comes on at a certain time. And that's generally driven by a time clock. So what our sensors are doing is collecting data that allows the building to become aware of people, and that data can be used to kind of optimize the building systems, as well as help the organization to reduce its footprint and reduce its costs.
Got you, got you. So it must generate quite a lot of data then. I'm just thinking, how do you make that something that people can understand and can make sense of?
It's generating millions of readings a day at the moment. So way more than you could easily manage using an Excel spreadsheet or something of that nature. So what we actually do is that we create data summaries that are made available to customers through a live dashboard or through an API, so that they can take the data from our system and connect it with their systems. And if they want to include third-party data on their side, they can do that. It is really difficult to try and visualize this data, but we kind of find that two approaches have really worked well. So people generally understand a floor plan. So what we do is we use a heat map approach to show intensity of use, for example, and show you the hot spots and the cold spots, where people are actually using the building and where they're not. And that actually transmits a huge amount of data in a very short, very nice compact way. The other side of it is that we're looking at, of course, looking at the environmental data and trying to kind of provide information on how people impact, for instance, the CO2 level in a building or the temperature in a building. And to do that, we're generally using sort of timeline approaches to help people kind of understand that. But yeah, that amount of data needs to be kind of boiled down and delivered in easy, digestible format, using kind of KPIs and metrics that are easy to compare week on week, month on month.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And funny you talk about CO2. One of our other speakers, John Saltmarsh, who works for BEIS, was talking about where does CO2 come from? And buildings is one of the biggest generators of CO2, which I hadn't realized. So I imagine that there may be legislation or incentives for companies to reduce that. So your technology is going to come in extremely useful for that too.
Yeah.
Yeah,
indeed.
yeah. So it sounds like with the trend of going towards flexible working, companies were already starting to realize they had too much space. But of course, now that COVID-19 has hit, it's really brought it into sharp relief. And I know that two of our members are now looking at whether they need to, when the lease comes up for their premises, find something smaller. And that's definitely the way that people are going. And on the other hand, of course, when social distancing has to be observed, you're going to need more space for the number of people. So how do you see that playing out?
There is a kind of fundamental issue, reconciling those two approaches. I guess that, there are organizations that have already announced publicly that they are not going to ask people return to the office at all. So in the US, companies like Twitter and Box have made public statements that they are going to continue to allow people to work from home all the time. There isn't a need to return to the office at all. So I think that's at one extreme, where organizations have worked out that if we're a digital organization, if we're using technology that's our output is technology, it makes no difference where people are conducting that work. And that's been proven over the last 2 months or 3 months of lockdown. And there's a certain amount of sense in that. You can kind of understand that. For other organizations, that's not going to fit, where they really do need to get people in together to work together in order to deliver their output. But I think output is the kind of the key word, that organizations now are being able to focus on how do we deliver output when people are not physically together. And tools such as the one we're using at the moment, Zoom or Google Meet or Microsoft Teams, so much more of the population has now been exposed to using those tools because of lockdown, and have probably now worked out that, you know what, this is actually pretty good. It's not the same as being in the office. It's different, and I need to operate and work in a different way. But the tools really work. I can share documents, I can read my email, I can get access to the corporate file store. I can do pretty much most of what I needed to do without having to be in the office 5 days a week. So I think the impact of this is not necessarily going to be at the Twitter and Box end. I think that they are edge cases, but I think that we will see organizations making the decision that, you know what, 3 days in the office and 2 days at home, that could work. Or 4 days in the office, 1 day at home, that could work. Mm. Any one of these decisions will have a direct impact on the amount of real estate that they need, but only if they do that in concert with the move to flexible working. So making it possible to share desks, to share rooms, to be able to book them in advance so that you know when you're leaving your house in the morning that you have a desk to go to, and you're not roaming the corridors looking for a free desk when you get to the office. That can't happen, and the technology is available, to make sure that that doesn't happen. But once you get to the office, social distancing protocols are going to change the way that offices look and feel. They are going to require that organizations derate their buildings, reduce the number of people that can be accommodated in the building at any particular time. They are going to have to allow for desks to be rotated amongst people. They're going to have to allow for much more rigorous cleaning regimes and cleaning rotas to be put in place so that a desk cannot be used by another person until it's been properly cleaned and everyone knows that it's been prepared and is ready for use. So there are lots of new requirements that are going to be put in place that are going to change the way we use space. They're going to change the way that we approach our work. And that I think it's entirely plausible and entirely possible that even if you go to the office, you might still be having Zoom calls with your colleagues, because that's actually safer than going into a meeting room together. So from a risk standpoint, you do a video conference in the office with your colleagues rather than share a room together. So I think that there's a very rapid evolution. And for us as a business, COVID-19 has created a very interesting opportunity, because our technology suddenly comes into its own, where we can help organizations to understand the distance between people. How long were they within 2 meters? How many people were in the meeting room? Was it more than the capacity should be for that room? And how long did that happen for? So if you're an organization looking to implement risk management approaches to inform your staff about good practice and ensure that good practice is undertaken, and you're trying to do that across a distributed estate, you need tools and data to help you do that. And that's exactly what we're providing, and which is exactly why right now it's been there's been a huge increase in interest for our technology and our solutions.
I can imagine that. What strikes me is that even if you do that, there might still be risk within the building due to the air conditioning. And I'm just thinking about something that perhaps is true about the property sector. Things change slowly because you've got all that investment in infrastructure and the way that things are set up. Do you think that something is going to become, it's going to become more obvious that it's important to change that, but it might take some time? And in the meantime, is it actually going to be safe if there's air conditioning in the building?
It's certainly being in a building where you have forced ventilation and air conditioning, where you have air being recirculated around the building. It's incredibly important that that building has a proper cleaning regime, a sanitizing regime that's taking place on the equipment to make sure that the building isn't just simply recirculating the bug or the bugs or whatever it might be. So there's got to be a kind of a higher degree of awareness that those systems need to be managed and maintained to a greater degree. But also the way that they operate has to change. So you have to think about things like if a meeting room has been used for an hour, and you can't just have the next team turn up into the room straight after the meeting. You have to have some sort of increase ventilation rate, flush that room with clean air before the next meeting starts. So that's a change to the way that the building would normally operate. It wouldn't normally, put the ventilation rate up to the max for 10 minutes between meetings, because that's not how it works. It's a more continuous, keep the building at a continuous level of CO2 or temperature, or humidity. So now you have situations where the building systems are going to have to be adjusted. Ventilation rates might need to be reduced to stop the kind of the effect of air blowing across the building, because if you've sat in a building where there is mechanical ventilation, you actually notice air blowing across you. You kind of know, and that's in this world we're living in at the moment, that increases the risk of transmission. So you want to try and find ways to alleviate or mitigate that risk, but you have to balance that with keeping the building comfortable and productive, a space that people can actually get their job done. So it's going to be a really tricky balancing act to get that right. I'm not a heating, ventilation, air conditioning engineer, but I'm guessing that they've been working really hard to work out how best to accommodate those new needs.
And talking about different realms and different disciplines, can you see your company partnering up with others to enhance the kind of service that you can offer?
I definitely. I think that the data we're producing, we have already had sort of experimental projects connecting our data with building management systems, and that's yielded some really interesting results. So that means that instead of the building management system operating based on a kind of a time clock, or even just a simple sensor that detects whether the room has been in use or not in use, it can actually use things like the number of people that have been in the room or the CO2 level in the room to make decisions about how long the air conditioning should run for, what the ventilation rate should be. So it's back to this thing about our data allows the building to become aware of people. And with that data, you can then allow the building to support people more effectively, to make it a more comfortable environment. And in the case of COVID-19, hopefully make it a more safe environment or a lower risk environment, because the building systems can do their part in conjunction with, what people are doing around social distancing.
Yeah. And what about, years ago when I was a chemist, we used to use Draeger tubes for detecting gases in the air. Just thinking about combining that with your machine vision in some way.
Yeah, there is. So we are detecting from our devices CO2 and VOCs, and those are those two gases, concentrations of certain types of VOC and CO2. I don't know whether there's a huge amount of science behind this, but my understanding is that they could act as indicators for increased risk of transmission of COVID-19. So the fact that we're able to measure that and at least be able to tell the building owners that in parts of your building we're seeing increased concentrations of VOCs and CO2, you might want to adjust your systems in that part of the building to reduce that and to bring that down. yeah, that could could have an impact. But actually, there's been a lot of, I think that there are opportunities to look at new sensors and new technologies because of what we've been going through. There are pieces of lab-based research around viral load sensors and trying to kind of understand, um, uh, how much of a particular bug is in the air. And going forward, that could become incredibly important. I think we're quite a long way away from having commercially available or commercially ready sensors that could do that. But that would certainly be something that we would love to include within our device, so that we could provide, even without COVID being there, if we could provide the occupier of a building some information about the fact that there's, I don't know, there's a flu bug going around, and that
Yeah.
might take out a large number of your team. You might want to do something about that. Ask people to work from home for a bit longer until that goes away. So
Mm,
these new technologies will certainly emerge and be driven by what we're going through, I guess, this kind of COVID-19
mm, mm.
response.
Yeah, and I think I was reading the other day that there are some who believe that COVID-19 is just the beginning, that in fact we were due a big pandemic, and may well be more in the next few years. And so actually this is a great opportunity to get ready. Um, yeah, fascinating, fascinating. Well, having chatted with you before today, I know that you're a great forward thinker. And so, I do ask most people, where do you think this is headed in the long term? So what kind of visionary pictures do you have about what things could look like in businesses and buildings in the future? Where do you think we might be headed?
I'd say that, with the way that technology is looking, I guess that we are for the first time in property, collecting vast quantities of data about how people really use buildings. And that what we're seeing and understanding is that um, we know that organizations could operate in less space, but we've got this kind of almost contradiction with what's going on with COVID-19, that you need to give people more space so that they can have that kind of social distance. So I think that we're going to see going forward changes to the way that buildings are laid out. If you think about the way that a building is constructed, a typical commercial office is constructed on what's called a shell and core basis. So the walls and the floors and the main infrastructure in the building is put in place, and then an interior designer will lay out a floor plan that has the seats laid out and where the informal meeting spaces are, and the meeting rooms. And then all of the internal air conditioning and electrical circuits, all of these things are put in place around that original design. Inevitably what happens, because things move on, is that the layout changes. The desks are moved around, the room walls are shifted, but that infrastructure that's been put in place, the ventilation and the electrical circuits, that's much more difficult to move. So what you end up with very quickly are kind of suboptimal buildings. They were optimal when they were built, but they become suboptimal. I think that what we're going to see in building design is more modular approaches to design, trying to look at ways where we can decouple the space that we use to work in from the superstructure of the building, so that they can be moved around. So I can absolutely imagine, you having a desk and a chair that is a rechargeable desk and chair that gets recharged overnight, has all the power it needs, doesn't need to be coupled to a socket on the floor in order for you to do your job. I could also imagine that desk and chair could be something that is something more akin to a business class airline seat. Something that is designed to be comfortable in the long term, allows you to adjust your position, probably knows who you are, probably knows how cool or how warm you would like things, what position you would like your seat to be in, how many, how you'd like your screens to be set up and oriented. So things where the intelligence that's coming from things like the mobile phones we walk around in the pocket, the building is able to kind of react to that, to bring you a desk that is suited for your needs. So property moves incredibly slowly. So even if I had this thought right now, I don't expect that this is going to happen for a decade or more, but I could be wrong about that because there's been an increasing amount of investment going into property technology. So these things are becoming more and more, are arriving in the market faster and faster than they were before. But I could definitely picture this idea of these kind of modular seats that could self-organize. The layout of the building isn't fixed. If I want to work with my colleagues, my desk will wind its way to where my colleague is, and I'll sit with them. So yeah, it's got to be something around you or the desk not being a static object anymore. The desk being something that's also flexible and tailored to you. So that when you sit down at it, it's something that you feel super comfortable in and really productive in.
I just had a picture in my head of people who are in existing buildings but need to have that added protection and that modular feel, almost like being in a hospital cubicle to protect them from the air conditioning, but that evolving into something a lot more sophisticated in time when resources allow. But golly, it raises so many questions because you've got so much estate that probably you don't want to knock down. It might have historical significance or whatever, and you've got to work with that. And
yeah, that's true. And this the kind of the application of technology has got to be sympathetic to that. That there are buildings that have genuinely been around for hundreds of years. Our office in Glasgow is a Georgian townhouse. You're not going to change that building dramatically on the exterior, but you can change the interior and the way that it functions through technology. And I guess that's what I would expect would happen. But you've also got to give people, I think, reasons to come to the office. You've got to give them a kind of a motivation or incentive, especially if we're a little bit kind of worried or reluctant because we're not sure about the risks. So being able to almost give you that cocoon, to give you that private space, it's somewhere between what happened in the 60s and 70s where people had private offices and where we are now, open plan. Open plan is a more efficient use of space. Cellular office is clearly more private and some would argue better for productivity in some cases, but we need to find a sort of happy middle ground that's between those two things, that has the benefits of open plan and cellular. And I guess if you look at, even if you think about it from the point of view that car manufacturers have been doing this with cars for quite a long time now, that as you walk to your car, it knows who you are. It adjusts your seat, it adjusts the steering wheel, it chooses your favorite station on the radio, it sets the aircon to your preferred level. It's doing all of this based on it knowing who you are. I would argue that's what I want in the office. I want my office seat to do that for me when I turn up to the office, especially if I'm working flexibly and it's not my desk all the time. I still want a degree of personalization. I want the space to feel like it's mine when I get there.
Yeah, and I've just had a link in my brain there. One of our other speakers, Professor Stephen Potter, had quoted that the Chinese have reacted very quickly to COVID in the car industry by coming up with a fabric for the car seats and the interiors that automatically disinfects any of the particles falling on them. Wow. Now you could imagine that same fabric being used in these cubicles.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, interesting. You two should talk. Or your clients should talk. Yeah. So that paints a really interesting picture, and I think there will be a lot of people watching this who are in charge of working spaces and maybe haven't thought some of this through, but will find it very, very helpful to hear all of this. And of course, you're going to be at the cafe, so they get a chance to ask you questions. But from the point of view of being an entrepreneur and an innovator, Now that I've got you here, I want to kind of get the chance to find out what you think are some key lessons that you've learned along the way in your career, having introduced something that is quite novel and is ahead of its time, maybe a bit, or of its time. It's now coming into its time now. But it'd be really interesting if you have any wisdom that you'd like to share with other people who'll be watching this, because I'm sure they'd find it quite helpful and inspiring.
Yeah, well, thank you. I guess that the most important point is to do something. You know, so if you have an idea, but do something in a domain that you know something about. So the project I was working on just before Beringar was a project in a different industry that had a different lexicon, a different value set, and a different way of describing how value was created and transformed. And I didn't know the words. I didn't understand how to sell a perfectly good product that solved a perfectly reasonable problem, but I just didn't have the language. I didn't have the connections, and I didn't have the language. So I guess that, you know, the lesson for me with Beringar was getting right back to what I know best, what I understand implicitly. And I guess you really don't realize how much you know about something until someone starts to ask you a question about your experience, and you suddenly realize that actually I've seen this before. I saw this 12 years ago, so you know it's kind of there. It's in my head. So I think focusing on a domain that you understand well. That's not to say that if you have an incredible idea that is groundbreaking and earth-shattering that's not in your domain, don't do it. But I would just say, from my experience, it's easier to get traction in a domain that you understand, in a domain that you can know. So for me, what I know is I know how to take the data that we're creating from Beringar and turn that into money. And that's a key lesson. So lots of businesses right now are creating data, but people want to know how that translates into money. So unless you can explain that, you're not going to get very far. So that would be a key takeaway. Know the route from data to money and be able to explain it really, really clearly. The other aspect is that we went into the business of Beringar. We started actually in the health sector, and the health sector created a series of constraints for us. A lot of constraints around confidentiality and privacy that are much more extreme than the constraints that you might see in a standard commercial office. So our sensor had to work in a space where there was a doctor-patient consultation taking place. So it had to be super private, super confidential. It also couldn't connect to the building systems, because trying to get access to NHS IT systems is very difficult. And it had to be something that could go on every ceiling of every room for it to make any sense. So those constraints really helped us focus on building the solution. So I'd say second lesson, if there is one, is to find your constraints and operate within those constraints. So don't give yourself a blank sheet of paper. Create the constraints, because the constraints will be there. The market will determine the constraints. So that's part of knowing your domain, knowing your market, and finding those constraints. And then the final thing for me was I genuinely didn't know how difficult it was to build hardware. I've built software for decades. I've run software companies, but I'd never built hardware. So I was naive about how difficult it would be. But that actually plays in your favor, I think, because it allows you to, it's almost a Jeremy Clarkson thing. How hard can it be? And what we found is that because we have a great team, we didn't really understand how difficult the tasks we were asking them to do were. But because we could explain why it was needed, what the output would be, and how we turned it into money, they found ways to make it work. And so that naivety has been a really strong positive for us, because sometimes it's better not to know how difficult things are, because you blunder ahead, you make promises, you have to live up to your promises. And sometimes being slightly naive and making promises that you don't necessarily know how you're going to fulfill or keep. There's creativity in trying to solve that problem, and there's innovation needed to make sure you can get to the solution. So yeah, those would be 3 lessons, I would say, or 3 things to consider.
Oh, it's really, really helpful. Good stuff, good stuff. Do you think that being, because I'm making an assumption here that you might be a smaller organization compared to some of our members who are well established and part of large corporates. Do you think there are advantages to being a small organization at the level of growth of your organization that you're at now?
There is, I guess, the directness, the ability for us to identify a problem and get to a solution without there being a kind of a overarching structure that determines how you approach building the solution. So yeah, you can be more agile. You can experiment more quickly, arrive at what doesn't work as well as what works more quickly. And I guess that overall, you can get to a solution faster, but the flip side of that is, as a small organization, it then becomes challenging to execute that on a larger scale. So that's the flip side of it. You can get to the answer faster, but then to be able to put that into the market at scale, that's where your challenges begin. And I guess it's the opposite way around for larger organizations. It might take them longer to get to the answer, but they have the means and the mechanisms to get that answer out to a larger audience faster. I would like us to have slightly more resources than we have right now, because it would be nice to be able to do some of the things that we're not able to do right now. But I think having this very concentrated small team that knows what we do intimately, those lines of communications are so much shorter. It just enables us to get the answers or get a solution to a customer so much more quickly.
Yeah, and I actually wouldn't be at all surprised if some of our members in the larger companies aren't in the process of setting up small special teams who can work in that way. I know for sure 2 of them are doing this. And the whole concept of agile, which has come from IT, has kind of caught a flame really, and people are really recognizing the benefits of this whole idea of failing fast to learn quickly in iterative process and iterative product development. Yeah, so and part of the purpose of the community of the network is so that people like you can meet people like them and help each other.
And that's what's happened. So again, COVID-19 has been a real driver for interest in our business. And what we're seeing are large established players contacting us because they know that we have a solution, that they may well be developing something similar, but it's not in the market yet, and that we have our solution in the market, and it's working. And that rather than try and develop something from scratch, they're asking to partner with us. How can our solution be incorporated with theirs, so that we can access that larger market? And that's great for us. So that's what we would like as a small organization, to partner with someone that can bring scale or bring scalability. So yeah, I think that's definitely for mutual benefit. It's definitely for mutual benefit.
Great. Well, I think you might meet a few interesting people at the cafe. Fingers crossed. Fingers crossed.
Okay, great.
So, do you have a parting word at all for people at this really strange time that might be helpful for them?
I guess that in terms of where we are right now, it's as the lockdown unlocks, and as I don't think the world is ever going to return back to what it was before lockdown. I think that the way that we use space and our approach to how we do our jobs, that's now received a fundamental shock, and it's not going to go all the way back. There are going to be people that are going to want to go back to work because they are so tired of social distancing, they're so tired of being at home, that they want to get back to the office and will be desperate to get back to the office. There will be those that have been super comfortable working at home. It's all working for them. They don't have to commute, you know, they don't have to go through the kind of the daily grind that they had to go through to get to their job and to do their work, and that they're going to be really comfortable where they are. And then there's going to be this group in the middle that are a little bit, you know, could go either way. So I think if you're an organization trying to develop an approach to how best do we use our real estate going forward, just consider that. Consider that there will be those push-pull feelings, and there's not a one-size-fits-all for the organization. What we've been experiencing over the last 2 or 3 months is people being able to get on delivering output without worrying about supervision or overarching structures or the time clock or where things get done. They've just been able to focus on producing output. So I hope that, you know, in amongst that mix of accepting that different people will have different needs, there's also an acceptance that we need to be more output driven and focus on what people produce, not where they produce it or when they produce it, but what they produce. Because ultimately it's about making business more productive, and that our small part, we believe, is that if a space is efficient and a space is productive, it will help people be more productive. And it's difficult to prove that. There are not a lot of metrics that will give you a one-to-one correlation with that. But I think if we focus on output approaches to getting work done, it will allow us to free our minds, use the technology, and use less resources than we're currently using to get the job done. So that's got to be good for business.
That's a very good synopsis of the kinds of issues that I think will be really helpful for our members to hear. So that's great. But Mark, thank you. That the whole chat has been so illuminating and fascinating, and I think it might even raise more questions, which unfortunately we don't have time for right now. But let's keep talking, and hopefully you'll stay involved with the network. But it's been a real pleasure and a real kind of education for me anyway. So thank you very, very much.
It's been a pleasure also, Siobhan. Thank you so much for the opportunity. And, you know, I really look forward to the cafe and seeing the questions that emerge. Thank you so much.
Great stuff. Thank you.